Good evening, and thanks for joining us for this special hour-long edition of the 7:30 Report. Tonight we examine the financial empire of one of the world's most powerful media magnates, Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch now has American citizenship, of course, taken out to help his access to the US television industry. But I think much of the world, and certainly most of us in this country, still see him as an Australian, a man who launched his career with a not-so-great Adelaide newspaper and became the greatest, certainly the biggest newspaper proprietor this century. Now, even raising questions about the financial stability of the seemingly unstoppable Murdoch empire would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Now, with News Corp shares a fraction of their price at the beginning of the year, one such analysis has sent trembles through the market. That story is this: Empire, reported by Christopher Hurd.
There was no comment today from the mogul's fortified retreat on his troubled financial state. So what is known of this man, the greatest media tycoon of this or any other generation, Cavan's landlord, Keith Rupert Murdoch? From his privileged beginnings at his father's paper in Adelaide, Australia, Murdoch relentlessly bought and sold his way around the world. Hiring and firing, making friends.
I like him.
And enemies.
People like him in this world have got to be stopped.
No public issue on which the Murdoch papers took no stand. No public figure they did not support or denounce. Often support and denounce. A man about whom there are many opinions.
Charming.
A gambler.
Dogmatic and difficult.
He's a workaholic.
A wonderful man.
Rather brash.
Devious.
I think he's the greatest journalist I've ever come across.
And still another opinion.
Well, he was well dressed.
The public life that denied him a truly private life. A provider. A husband. Immortalized in print and film, Murdoch's empire in its glory held dominion over newspapers, TV stations, airlines, paper mills, publishing, movies. An empire upon an empire, from which for 30 years seemed to flow an unending stream of wealth. Legendary as the Murdoch empire may be, can it now survive?
Tonight, Sky and BSB have merged with a combined investment of £1.25 billion.
Sky Movies, then there's the movie channel of BSB, which together have really all the movies in the world.
This was vintage Rupert Murdoch. After losses of almost £400 million, the Sky threatened to fall in on his media empire. But the deal with BSB seemed to change all that. The opposition was wiped out at a stroke, and the shares of Murdoch's company, News Corporation, rose in relief on stock markets across the world. For the public, it only confirmed the irresistible rise of Murdoch, the mogul who had built a vast media empire on his vision, ruthlessness, and financial daring. He started with newspapers, and these produced the cash to pay the banks who lent the money to build the empire which Murdoch wanted. But there is another side to the Murdoch story, a tale of an empire built on political influence and on avoiding media controls. An empire that has been kept alive by questionable accounting policies and tax dodging on a world scale is now groaning under massive debts and teetering on the brink. In addition, Murdoch personally has been involved in suspect share dealings. A remarkable outturn for a man who has drawn admiration and outrage in equal amounts over 3 decades. Murdoch's Australian News Corporation is a £4 billion a year business, stretching across 4 continents. But this isn't a faceless multinational. This company is known by the name of its boss. It's the Murdoch Press. Many people see his hand in every move that the business makes, every view that it expresses. This was never more evident than in London in 1969, when in one of the most important moves in his career, he took over and relaunched the ailing Sun newspaper. Here, as elsewhere, Murdoch's hands-on management style was legendary. Vic Giles was with Murdoch on the night the Sun was launched.
On that first night, the man was absolutely everywhere. I discovered that he wrote the most magnificent captions, that he could write headlines, that he could go to the stone, the hot metal stone where pages were being produced. He understood the typography. He could tell the composing people, the men behind the stone, exactly where they were going wrong, what the paper should be looking like in this particular area. He could sit down and subcopy. He could write a story. And this I found quite remarkable. Together with the fact that he was a corporate director of some magnitude, I couldn't believe my eyes.
Neither could the readers. In characteristic style, Murdoch had spotted a market where no one else could see one. The financial fortunes of his son rose rapidly as the paper took a delight in attacking killjoy politicians, especially of the right.
People had not been used to an outrageous newspaper. They had not been used to a paper that questioned the establishment in the way that the Sun did. The Daily Herald before it, you see, had not dared, even though it was left-wing, to do the sort of things that the Sun did, because the Sun did it in a happy, carefree, jocular way that got the point home, but indeed, of course, made the readership understand that whoever it was, whatever politician it was a fool and an idiot, and shouldn't be doing what he was doing.
Many thought Murdoch shouldn't be doing what he was doing when the Sun invented the page 3 girl. That Murdoch knew his formula attracted millions of readers and was experienced in defending himself and his papers.
I'm not ashamed of any of my newspapers at all. And I'm rather sick of snobs who tell us that they're bad papers, snobs who only read papers that no one else wants. I doubt if they read many papers at all. And whereas on most issues they consider themselves liberals or radicals or something, they think they ought to be imposing their taste on everybody else in the community.
The Soaraway Sun quickly became one of the main profit powerhouses of the Murdoch empire. Today, it is the largest selling English-language daily newspaper in the world, with a daily circulation of around 4 million. Its profits have helped Murdoch buy other, quite different papers. The papers may change, but the Murdoch management style doesn't.
What's the point of this section?
Well, they're previews of new people, new things, new cars.
Why?
Well, because they're new.
We have the whole section of black and white called innovations. I'm going to have a real argument with you one of these days about this. If you don't listen to me, do what I want, then, you know, it's going to be your fault, not my fault, if it doesn't work.
Sure.
What's this about? Oh, no. Oh, Peter. It's about the Ripper. Nobody wants to read about the Ripper.
You told me you find it irresistible.
No, I didn't. I did the Ripper, it's a turn-off.
That was Rupert Murdoch in the early 80s, grilling the editor of the Sunday Times colour magazine. Today, Murdoch runs one of the world's biggest media empires, but spot checks like that are still part of his style. He appoints trusted lieutenants, parachutes in to check on them, and deals with them if they don't do what he wants. In this way, he ensures that the Murdoch papers are produced to the Murdoch formula.
He talks in formula terms. He has formulas for newspapers, and so there's a broadsheet formula, and there's a popular formula, and there's a downmarket tabloid formula, and so on. And to me, newspapers are very much creatures of their own communities, particularly in a country like Australia or America, where newspapers are metropolitan rather than national.
The type of paper Murdoch feels happiest handling is a tabloid, but one of his mistakes has been exporting his version of a tabloid paper downmarket and sensational, which can shock and amaze on every page, around the world. The formula worked well in England and Australia, so he attempted to do the same in America, with the successfully upmarket tabloid, the Chicago Sun-Times.
We knew that there had been publications that he basically left alone, the Village Voice and papers that had a very strong identity of their own. And we thought, well, maybe he might do that here, since it was a very successful quality newspaper. But as soon as his people started coming in, well before the deal was finalized, it was clear that that wasn't their intention. They came in like a bunch of pirates. It's kind of like having a nice ship and it's boarded by all these guys with eye patches and swords.
That is a nothing picture.
Yeah.
No one cares, nothing.
Yeah.
The picture of the tragic family is everything. People would stare and look at the picture of those poor little kids for minutes and minutes and minutes. Yeah.
But in this case, Murdoch's sensationalist approach did not work on the Chicago readers.
Grandparents have a picture of the family.
I think that he thought the formula he used, it was a tabloid, and Murdoch's thoughts are a tabloid must be something you put a screaming headline on, a lurid murder, or something crazy. Not long after he had the paper, I was driving down the street and I could see from my car window that Cary Grant, the legendary movie star, there was a big black bordered photo of him covering almost the entire front page. And I thought, oh, gee, Cary Grant's dead. And people all over town were rushing over to buy the paper. Cary Grant it was his birthday. Well, that wasn't the kind of paper we put out. We didn't put fake pictures on page one and mislead the readers. And people were offended. They lost an awful lot of circulation very fast.
Despite setbacks like this, Murdoch has made millions from newspapers. But he has another interest, political power.
Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration.
Once the country got a very strong leader, like Margaret Thatcher, who opened up the path for Rupert Murdoch to develop his new type of newspapers, I think then he couldn't believe his good fortune, and indeed I think that he simply agreed that that was the best possible government that the country could have. I mean, he's been noted for changing governments in the past and having a certain influence on governments. I think that he felt that at last he'd come home. Thatcher was his girl.
Before the 1979 election, Margaret Thatcher was a regular visitor to Sun editorial meetings. The Sun backed her enthusiastically during the campaign. Then in 1981, Murdoch got the Times and Sunday Times. A press takeover of this size should have been referred to the Monopolies Commission, but Murdoch escaped such scrutiny.
I think it's very important to realise that Murdoch was in cahoots with Mrs. Thatcher from very early on in her first government. And even more important perhaps, Mrs. Thatcher wanted Rupert Murdoch to own the Times. The papers he already owned, The Sun and the News of the World, had been extremely supportive of her in the '79 election. For him to own the Sunday Times and the Times as well, and presumably lend their support to her, I am sure is the main reason why an application that screamed to be referred to the Monopolies Commission, 45% of all circulation, was rushed through by John Biffin, the Trade Secretary, in 3 days in the House of Commons.
Many feared that Murdoch's takeover of Times newspapers would threaten the paper's traditional editorial independence.
And Murdoch, to avoid being referred to the Monopolies Commission, which he certainly should have been, gave written undertakings which were broadly designed to protect the independence of the editor, the hiring and firing of the editor, and the editor's political freedom of movement, given that he conversed with the proprietor. Murdoch broke every single one of those undertakings.
The Thatcher government helped in another way. The changes in union laws made it easy for Murdoch to sack 5,500 workers in the move to his computerised plant at Wapping. As a result, the profits of his British papers more than doubled. Across the globe, Murdoch has a knack of making friends and influencing people. In 1976, he bought the New York Post and turned it down market with his tabloid formula. In 1977, in the election for New York's mayor, he used the previously liberal paper to support the right-wing Democrat outsider in the campaign.
The phone rang about 7:30, and the conversation, I remember it so distinctly. It went something like this on the other end of the phone. Hello, Mr. Koch? This is Rupert. I thought to myself, I don't know any Ruperts. That's not a New York name. So I sort of cagily said, yes. And then his Australian accent became evident, and I knew immediately who it was, and I said, yes, Rupert. And then he said, Ed, we're going to endorse you this morning, and it's going to be on the front page of the Post. And he said it very low-key, and I hope it helps. And I said, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you're doing, because it means all the difference in the world. And that began our friendship.
How am I doing?
The Post's journalists were not so impressed with Murdoch's new friend. They signed a petition complaining about the paper's coverage of the election.
What did you say to your reporters who objected?
I said that I'm losing $10 million on this newspaper, and I'm entitled to support who I like.
How important was his endorsement?
Oh, without it, I would not have been elected, but only with it, I also would not have been elected.
Over in Australia, Murdoch used his papers initially to enthusiastically support, but then denounced the Labour leader Gough Whitlam. Murdoch's opponents burnt his papers in the street, and his journalists went on strike. With such changeable political loyalties, can any conclusions be drawn about Murdoch's own politics?
His personal politics are right-wing, and in this country for the last 10 years, he got very cross with any newspaper editors who didn't support Thatcher. But he's opportunist in his business dealings. He doesn't support only right-wing leaders, he supports winners. And he supports people who are going to promote his business interests.
Because the media is a business with enormous political and cultural influence, many governments have rules to control the concentration of ownership and to restrict proprietors from owning both newspapers and television stations. Once, even Murdoch saw the virtue of rules like these.
I think the important thing is that there'll be plenty of newspapers with plenty of different people controlling them, so that there's a variety of viewpoint, and that there's a choice for the public. This is the freedom of the press that is needed. Freedom of the press mustn't be one-sided just for a publisher to speak as he pleases, try and bully the community. There must be an alternative.
Today, however, in Australia, Murdoch controls newspapers with a staggering 2/3 of total newspaper readership. In Britain, he has over 1/3 of national paper readership and control of Sky TV. In America, he owns the 4th TV network, which can reach virtually all American homes. Over the years, Murdoch has bought and sold many media assets. He has frequently run up against the concentration and cross-ownership controls. But his political friendships have also brought influence. In 1979, Murdoch gained control of Australia's Channel 10 television station here in Melbourne, even though by now he lived in America. It looked as though there could be a problem, as he was no longer an Australian resident. However, there were politicians willing to help him out.
There was a law to say to own a television station you had to be an Australian resident. Now, it was quite clear that Murdoch in the early 80s was an American resident, and eventually when that came up, this was the Conservatives, in fact, changed the rules to say, well, you only had to be an Australian citizen, not a resident, and those, in fact, were called Murdoch Amendments.
4 years after the Australian government amended the law to make citizenship rather than residency the qualification, Murdoch showed his gratitude by giving up Australian citizenship and becoming an American to facilitate yet another business deal. This became a problem 2 years later when he wanted to take over Australia's biggest media group, the Herald and Weekly Times. Frequently, non-Australians are banned from owning Australian newspapers.
He was subject to the Foreign Takeovers Act in Australia. That gives the Treasurer discretion to say that a proposed foreign acquisition of an Australian company is not in the national interest. Naturally, there were cries that that piece of legislation ought to be used to prevent Rupert Murdoch acquiring as much of the Australian press as he did, and the government did nothing with those powers and has suppressed, resisted very fiercely under the Freedom of Information Act, attempts to find out why it did so.
In America, Murdoch soon made his political sympathies clear to the staff of the papers he acquired, like the Chicago Sun-Times.
There were orders given shortly after he took over that Ronald Reagan was never to be criticized in an editorial. And that paper editorially had been very much an independent paper. If it became necessary to criticize anyone, they were told that they could criticize one of his underlings, his cabinet member or somebody, but not Reagan himself.
In Washington, a track record like that was a real asset. Again, Murdoch found a way through the regulatory minefield when he planned his expansion into television. He made an immediate impression on the Reagan administration as a man with a mission.
It became pretty evident fairly quickly that this man had big plans, had an enormous vision of what could be, and had the courage and apparently the wallet to back up those convictions. Saw things other people didn't see and was willing to take risks and was willing to pay some extraordinarily high prices.
Mark Fowler was Reagan's appointee to the Federal Communications Commission, the media regulator committed to sweeping away many of the regulations. Murdoch soon needed his help. The planned Fox television takeover ran up against the ban on owning both a newspaper and a television station in the same area. Murdoch already owned the New York Post and a paper in Boston. The regulators came to Murdoch's rescue.
It was necessary for us to provide him with a temporary waiver, I believe it was 18 months, to divest of either the newspaper interest or the television interest. We thought that was reasonable. Otherwise, he would have had a fire sale in having to sell something so quickly. And this way, he could, in an orderly manner, sell the assets.
Murdoch won time with Washington's favor. Without forced sales, he was able to finance the huge startup costs of Fox TV. The regulators had to fight for Washington's waiver in the courts, but Murdoch lost the bigger battle to abolish the cross-ownership rules completely, and the New York Post and the Boston TV station had to go. His expansion into American television proved to be a business nightmare. It was one of the moves which engulfed Murdoch in the financial crisis which his empire now faces. Rupert Murdoch has always been a gambler, but in the 80s, with the takeover of titles like Daily Racing Form, America's leading racing paper, he has gambled for higher and higher stakes. For 3 decades, he built his empire on borrowed money, effectively mortgaging the business every time he took a big risk. But to move into book publishing and magazines and to finance the losses of high-risk TV ventures, he has borrowed more than ever before. However, now the market has turned against him. Now Murdoch plain hops around the world, not buying businesses, but trying to sell them. Not borrowing from bankers, but begging for time. It's Murdoch's recent foray into the uncharted territory of film and television, which has produced some of News Corp's greatest financial crises. In the mid-80s, Murdoch borrowed $1.5 billion to buy the 20th Century Fox film studio and 6 American TV stations. He then launched America's 4th television network, Fox TV, some of whose programs were to come from the film studio. This was a huge gamble that either questioned Murdoch's judgment or showed his great vision, depending on your point of view. Fox had to persuade a lot of independent television stations to take their programs. They were skeptical.
They quite naturally said, well, what are your programs? And we replied, well, we don't quite know what they are, but they're going to be very good. The important part about that is that Rupert Murdoch, the mystique associated with his name, was the glue that held just that part of the effort together. Without his reputation, his name, his financial commitment, that whole effort, I think, would have fallen apart immediately. We would have been thrown out of a lot of offices.
But Murdoch did not understand television as well as newspapers. For months, Fox searched in vain for a distinctive program formula.
In retrospect, I would think that some people at Fox would probably deny that we came anywhere close to folding up. I would say that's most certainly not true. I think we came within a couple of weeks of going out of existence because there was no perception that this drain in terms of an outflow of cash was going to stop. Something had to change to make that different.
Then, just in time, Fox discovered tabloid TV with America's Most Wanted. This brought to the screen some of the sensational values of newspapers and got into full swing with A Current Affair, television to shock and amaze.
It broadcast the pleadings of a woman about to die in a tower block fire.
I can't believe I'm going to pass out. We'll send an ambulance. Hurry!
Did anybody do anything finally?
Yeah, they found her body at 4:45 in the morning.
This was followed by groundbreaking irreverent programs like the ratings hit The Simpsons. But even with these successes, Fox is vulnerable to competition from the rich networks.
A viewer of U.S. television will say that the networks are beginning to catch on to what it was that Fox did. And there is no bar, there is no impediment from them duplicating that effort in kind and in quantity if they want to.
Even though Fox has an uncertain future, this hasn't stopped Murdoch pressing ahead with another high-risk television venture.
We are seeing, I think, the dawn of an age of freedom for viewing and freedom for advertising.
So far, Sky Television has lost £400 million. It is still losing money, adding to Murdoch's major problem, his debts. News Corp's debts now stand at more than £4 billion. And for every pound of profit Murdoch makes, he has to pay a nail-biting 80 pence in interest. Financial centres like Wall Street are worried, and the agencies who rate News Corporation's attractiveness to investors and bankers have given it a low rating.
The rating is a junk bond rating. It reflects a very high level of financial risk. Murdoch, over several years, has grown principally through debt-financed expansion, both internally and through acquisitions. As a result, although his cash flow of combined operations is very large, the cash flow coverage of his interest charges is extremely thin.
What's happened this year is there has been a lack of confidence. I mean, Murdoch's great skill has been the fact that he's got so far already with only perhaps 1990 being a problem. I mean, he has expanded so rapidly, but this year we've seen a lot more scepticism about over-leveraged companies. Interest rates are going up, the economy is going down, so his cash flow is going down. So it's all working against him. But probably the surprising thing is that not so much it's happening, but that it hasn't happened before.
Murdoch survived so far because he has always been able to meet his interest payments with the cash from businesses like The Sun. He's also been a dab hand at dealing on the share and foreign exchange markets to produce windfall profits, and selling businesses to produce much-needed cash. When they had money to lend, bankers gasped in awe at this act on the financial high wire. And there was always a safety net, the value of his assets. But with the recession and credit squeeze, increasingly attention is being focused on whether the assets are really worth what Murdoch claims. For years, Murdoch has kept the empire growing by an accounting mirage.
Well, what he does is every 3 years he revalues his media assets all around the world, and the last one has been the biggest ever revaluation. In about June, July, he revalued all his assets around the world at by over $3 billion. So overnight he said, all my assets around the world, they're worth $3 billion more, which a lot of people were fairly sceptical of.
But the media properties that Murdoch is revaluing are not tangible assets like printing presses. They are the intangible assets, the titles of newspapers and magazines and television licenses. For example, 3 years ago, he valued his UK titles at just over 3.5 times profits. This year, he decided they were worth 7 times profits at over £1 billion, even though the media industry is in the middle of a recession and property values are falling. We asked Murdoch how he justified this write-up, and he said that News Corp's bankers, Hambros, valued these assets even higher at over $1.4 billion.
In the balance sheet itself, the intangible assets have been revalued by Murdoch. The only thing you can say about revaluation of intangible assets is that If you put two accountants in a room and ask them to revalue the asset, you probably get two different answers. So it's a highly subjective exercise.
Murdoch can only pull off this act on the accounting high wire because News Corp is still registered as an Australian company, even though half its profits are now made in America. This allows Murdoch to exploit Australia's loose accounting standards, under which he can revalue his assets as much as he likes.
He provided no detail as to how he got there, and it's something that is not allowed in America under American accounting standards, but it's allowed under Australian accounting standards. It increases your shareholders' funds, it allows you to go out and borrow more against that allegedly high value of your assets.
Murdoch's banks insist that News Corp keeps a gearing ratio of around 1:1. For every dollar of debt, there's just over a dollar's worth of assets. As the debts rise, Murdoch can revalue the assets, keeping the gearing ratio the same.
There's no doubt in my mind that News Corp has used these accounting conventions to achieve certain goals. The goal of the write-up of the intangibles has had to be to reduce its gearing ratio and presumably appease its bankers. The incredible thing to me is that this works. I mean, the information is there for anyone to look at. And if there is concern about this, certainly 1990 is not the year when the concern should have been raised. It should have been raised 3 or 4 years ago.
In the eager 80s, no one paid much attention to this. In the nervous 90s, it's a different story. Financial analysts are noticing that without the revaluations around the world of his titles, publishing rights and television licenses, Murdoch would be technically bust. Murdoch values News Corp's assets at over £10 billion. Take away the amount of money News Corp owes of around £5.8 billion, and the business is worth £4.5 billion. But without the revaluations of the titles and TV licenses, News Corp is worth minus £194 million. Without using the Australian accounting policies, Murdoch could never have borrowed so heavily.
I don't regard the expansion by debt as a strategic mistake. I mean, he's essentially done very, very well over the last 30 years by using debt. But a couple of things have gone against him. Interest rates are moving up around the world, plus you've got economies moving down, some into recession. So his big cash flow businesses, which is his British newspapers, his Australian newspapers, they've thrown off the cash to pay his interest. The revenues from those are coming down. So there's a few things going against him, but clearly he's been very bold, very opportunistic, and sooner or later you come up against financial constraints.
The bankers are now putting great pressure on Rupert Murdoch. It's a race against time. He needs to raise a lot of money fast to reduce his debt mountain. One option is to sell off some of his assets like Triangle, the publishers of Daily Racing Form and TV Guide, America's biggest selling weekly magazine. But it is not as easy as it looks.
Many of the properties that he might be interested in selling, take for example TV Guide, could only be purchased by a very large buyer. Hence, it's even more difficult to sell now, given that a larger buyer might not be interested in this particular property. TV Guide has been a little bit soft in terms of ad pages and revenues, and there's the issue of getting financing.
He paid quite a lot to buy the publishers of TV Guide. Do you think there's any chance that if he were to put it on the market, he could get that sort of price for it now?
I think the consensus opinion says he would not.
Murdoch is also looking at other ways to raise money. One way to do this is by issuing more shares or equity in News Corp. But Murdoch doesn't want to do this because normally shareholders have votes, and issuing more shares will reduce Murdoch's control of the company.
He's an expansion-minded person. He's wanted to buy assets. He's wanted to take over, to move around the world, build his media empire. But he wants to also retain control. He can't raise money by equity issues unless he wants to dilute his control, which he doesn't want.
At the News Corp annual meeting in October, Murdoch proposed a plan which would raise money by issuing more shares, but would keep him in control. He proposed non-voting shares. But Australian Mutual Provident, one of the largest shareholders outside the Murdoch family, was not impressed by this unusual tactic.
What we were objecting to was the passing of one of the resolutions which gave the company the opportunity to issue shares on which the shareholders didn't have full voting rights. And as a matter of principle, we believe that shareholders should have voting rights on the equity of the company.
This principle was voted down, but Murdoch is unlikely to issue any new shares yet. To raise the money News Corp needs, Murdoch would have to issue literally tens of millions of shares. This would dilute the Murdoch family holding in News Corp, and even if the shares had no votes, they would share in the profits, reducing the Murdoch family income. We have discovered that Murdoch seems keen to top up his income in ways which questions the propriety of his behaviour. There is clear evidence that Murdoch dealt in News Corp shares at times when one would have expected him to be in possession of price-sensitive information. Dealing in such circumstances is illegal. Murdoch denies he is guilty of the crime of insider trading, for which the maximum penalty in Australia is 5 years in prison. On the 25th of August 1988, News Corporation announced a surprise 27% increase in profits. The information was well received in the financial press. A month before the good news, Murdoch started buying over 2.25 million options to buy News Corp shares. An option is the right to buy shares at some time in the future at a price fixed today. Options are for gamblers, not long-term investors. If the share price rises, then you make money and can make a killing. But if it falls, you can lose everything. Of course, if you know for certain that good news is coming, it can be a wonderful one-way bet. For this reason, in Britain, it is automatically illegal for directors to deal in options in their company's shares. But American resident Murdoch bought on the Australian Stock Exchange. There is no ban on directors dealing in options in Australia, but there is a law against insider trading. To find out what constitutes a breach of the law, we asked a leading expert.
Essentially what they require is that a person who has a connection with a company over the last 6 months has obtained information that is not generally available through that connection. The information will have, or is likely to have, a material effect on the price of those securities, is then used for the purposes of trading. Whether or not you make a profit or avoid a loss, if you actually trade on the basis of that information, then theoretically the insider trading provisions are breached.
The key question is, did Murdoch have any confidential price-sensitive information when he bought the options? Murdoch first bought options in July, after the end of the financial year in June, but before the announcement of the results in August. This means the options were bought in what is known as the close period, that is between the end of the financial year and the announcement of the results. On the London Stock Exchange, directors are specifically prohibited from buying in this period because they are likely to have an advantage over other shareholders by knowing what the results are going to be. We asked Murdoch why he bought the options. He said he did so because he thought News Corp was a good investment, though in the end he made no money on the deal. He added he did not believe he had any price-sensitive insider information when he dealt. It may be that in the end Murdoch made no money, but it is a remarkable claim that he did not know what the results were going to be. Murdoch is renowned for his close monitoring of News Corp's performance through regular financial reports.
He's very much a hands-on manager. He's someone who keeps in contact with his operations around the world all the time, day and night. He's always on the phone. Each week, I understand he gets a list of figures from his operations all around the world.
There's a tremendously efficient reporting system back to New York or to London, wherever Murdoch may be in residence. Each week he would know exactly the circulations, the financial results of all his investments in this country and around the world. I think there's a constant contact by phone between Ken Cowley as the chief executive in this country and Murdoch. I think that's probably almost a daily procedure. So it is a hands-on operation.
With such close contact, questions are inevitably raised when Murdoch deals in News Corp shares. And we have discovered 2 other cases of suspect share dealing. In March 1989, News Corp announced plans to launch Media Partners International, a new venture which would help reduce News Corp's debts. In June, there were rumours that the project had hit trouble, but Murdoch reassured investors that although delayed, the deal would be successful. But at the same time, one investor took a more cautious view. A company called KRM sold £9 million worth of News Corp shares. KRM stands for Keith Rupert Murdoch. It's his investment company. 3 months after the timely share sale, the MPI deal was abandoned and the share price fell. In a third deal, KRM sold News Corp shares before everyone knew the bad news that there would be no increase in profits in 1990. Less than a week before this announcement, KRM sold 500,000 shares at over $16 a share. A week after the bad news was announced, the shares were down by a fifth, and KRM were more than £800,000 the richer than they would have been if they'd hung on to the shares. We asked Murdoch about both these deals, and he said, "I do not believe that those responsible for the decisions made in relation to the transactions had any price-sensitive information at the time of the transactions." When the shares were sold, Murdoch was no longer a director of KRM, but owned the company and controlled the appointment of the directors, which include one of his oldest business associates and 2 of his professional advisors. The October share sales would only be legal if the KRM directors knew nothing about the announcement that was made 4 days after the shares were sold. It is something of a mystery why an international businessman like Murdoch should court trouble in this way. The explanation may partly lie in his vision of himself as a world citizen above national boundaries, something perfectly illustrated by his attitude to governments which try to tax his business interests. Wherever in the world he operates, Murdoch has exploited loopholes in the tax laws. As a result, last year, News Corp paid less than 3 pence in the pound on its worldwide profits of around £170 million. In the UK, Murdoch has pulled off an incredible tax dodge, in which he could make profits of over £150 million without paying a penny of tax. The story goes back to 1982, when Murdoch and the other Fleet Street proprietors owned Reuters, the world's most famous international news agency.
It's the old Reuter watcher here. The gold fix at 11:32 is 380. Thank you very much.
But with the boom in financial information, Reuters was becoming a gold mine. When the newspaper barons realised this, they got together to cash in on this bonanza and turned Reuters from a trust to a company quoted on the stock exchange. Like the other Fleet Street proprietors, Murdoch had simply inherited his £1,000 stake in Reuters when he bought his Fleet Street papers. When Reuters was floated in 1984, his stake was worth £70 million. In a complex string of deals in the mid-80s, Murdoch passed 25 million Reuters shares around companies in his empire. The ultimate destination was the tax haven of the Netherlands Antilles. The purpose? To escape paying tens of millions of pounds of UK tax. In June 1985, 2 companies in Murdoch's News International sold the Reuters shares to a company called News Offset. Despite its name, this was not a printing company. Its major interest appears to be helping to offset taxes. A year later, the shares were moved again to 2 more companies in the empire. The capital gains tax on these transactions was £33 million. But no tax was handed over because the shares were never paid for, and therefore no tax was paid. However, News International still got the money for the shares it sold. It came back by a circuitous route as a loan, which was not taxable. But there was a problem. The shares were still in Britain. If Murdoch ever sold them at a profit, there might be a big tax bill to pay here. To avoid this, the 2 News International companies sold an option over the Reuters shares to another Murdoch company based in the Netherlands Antilles. The option gave the company the right to buy the Reuters shares at any time in the next 15 years, but at a fixed price. Since then, the tax haven company has exercised its option over most of the Reuters shares. boosting the News Corp coffers again by more than £100 million. The intricacies of the deal are complex, but if the Reuters shares had been simply sold on the stock exchange, Murdoch would have had to pay an estimated £50 million of tax. Instead, he has paid virtually nothing. There's nothing illegal about this, but when others use offshore tax havens, then there is no shortage of outrage from the Murdoch press. International tax dodging has been crucial to News Corp's growth. Without it, Murdoch would not have had enough cash to pay the interest on his loans. But now there are moves around the world to put a stop to this. These moves strike at the heart of News Corp's financing. Even in notoriously low tax-paying Hong Kong, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Murdoch's South China Morning Post, Southeast Asia's biggest-selling English-language newspaper, suddenly stopped paying taxes.
They're due to make $900 million odd of profits. That's £60 million. And they are showing something like $3 million of tax payable. Now, that is obviously a challenge to the existing system. It is way below the 16.5%. On a cursory look, a newspaper in Hong Kong, what excuse have they for not paying tax? The usual excuse in Hong Kong is that they earn the profits outside Hong Kong. Now, a newspaper, the bulk of which is sold in Hong Kong, the advertising is taken in Hong Kong. How come it's magicked away?
This is how the South China Morning Post magicked the tax away. In Hong Kong, if you buy some intellectual property, like a trademark or design, the cost is tax deductible, and if you sell it, you're not taxed on what you receive. But remarkably, there is nothing in the law which says these transactions have to be between separate companies. One of Hong Kong's leading tax experts is David Flux.
Now, in a group of companies, that very situation creates a loophole, or what we might call in the business a tax opportunity. And the loophole is simply that if a corporation in a group of companies owns some intellectual property of value and it sells it to a fellow company in that group, the sale proceeds are not taxable because it's a capital receipt, but the purchasing company gets a deduction for what it pays. So you create a once and for all tax deduction within a group.
It is just this loophole which Murdoch exploited in 1987 by simply selling the South China Morning Post masthead from one part of his group to another.
And from my knowledge of what happened in the South China Morning Post, some design property, namely the masthead of the newspaper, changed hands within the group of companies for some just under 2 billion Hong Kong dollars, and that just under 2 billion Hong Kong dollars was a tax deduction, which lasts an awful long time in Hong Kong.
If he gets away with it, this could mean that for the next 10 years, Murdoch will pay virtually no tax on the South China Morning Post profits of around £15 million a year. However, there is a problem. The Hong Kong tax authorities have not yet approved Murdoch's scheme, and if they refuse to let it through, the South China Morning Post will have to pay tax just like everyone else. And Murdoch will face a bill for backdated tax of around 150 million Hong Kong dollars. For years, tax havens have been at the centre of Murdoch's tax planning. Murdoch sets up News Corp companies in places like the Cayman Islands, Netherlands Antilles and Bermuda, where corporate tax rates are low or non-existent. Murdoch organises News Corp so that the profits which he makes in his high tax areas, like Australia, America and the UK, are shifted to countries where he makes losses and pays no tax, or to tax havens where the tax rate is very low. This is achieved through a complex web of companies across the world, but in essence, this is the way he does it. The tax haven company lends money to the other companies in the group. Because these are loans, there is no tax to pay when the money arrives. The interest on these loans soaks up the profits in the high tax area and the profits move offshore. Last year, Murdoch's News Corp made worldwide profits of £170 million. Its tax bill was just £4.5 million. Tax at the normal rate would have been nearly 10 times as much. News Corp can only get away with this because it is an Australian company. Its offshoots in America and the UK only pay tax on the profits they make there, whilst Australia does not tax Australian companies on their worldwide profits. However, all this is about to change following a recent parliamentary investigation into tax avoidance led by MP Stephen Martin.
In the case of News Corp, for example, it was the chief user of tax havens in terms of its contribution to group profit. Something like $387 odd million in 1988 was held in tax havens, which in fact contributed something like 110% of the group profit of that corporation. If they remitted the money that was made through various branches of their corporation overseas to the home jurisdiction back to Australia, they'd be charged at the corporate tax rate of 39 cents in the dollar. If, on the other hand, they keep them in these very low tax jurisdictions, charged 0 cents tax, then of course it is a great contribution to group profits.
Martin's inquiry asked News Corp to give evidence. They refused, but Murdoch's quality paper, The Australian, commented incisively on their work, accusing them of witch hunting and McCarthyism. But this time, Murdoch's political clout may not have its characteristic effect. It looks as though the law is about to change, and in future, News Corp will have to pay the full Australian tax rate.
So, in the long term, it's going to mean that the smarties who have tried to avoid their commitment to Australia, avoided paying tax in this country at the correct rate, are going to be caught in the net. And I think Australia's top 100 companies, those that are subject already to fairly extensive audits, are going to feel again the burden of the Australian Taxation Office in trying to get them to contribute their fair share. Because after all, governments don't collect tax revenues simply for the sake of it. The money that comes in goes to improving hospitals and roads and paying for defence forces, looking after social security. And unless we have a contribution from those that are making fairly large profits in the corporate sector, our ability to meet our commitments in a redistribution process suffer.
This could not have come at a worse time for Murdoch. In what could be one of the most significant financial developments in its history, tax authorities across the world are closing in on News Corp. In the past, Murdoch has kept growing by borrowing boldly, but today the cost is rising. He has made big profits on his newspapers, but today these are falling. He has sold businesses to keep going, but today there are few buyers. A sudden increase in his tax bill could upset a delicate balancing act which is already testing his bankers' nerves as never before.
Christopher Hurd reporting for Britain's Channel 4. We asked News Limited's Chief Executive Ken Cowley to respond, but Mr Cowley declined to be interviewed. Tomorrow night, we plan to bring you Australian reaction to Empire. We'll have comment from the financial press, from the stock market, and from politics. And just a word now about another story we'll have on the 7:30 report tomorrow.
One in every 1,000 Australian babies is born deaf. It's a condition that can be detected soon after birth. But children like these are unaware they're at the centre of a fierce international debate. If the Auslan advocates are right, the main problem these children have may not be their deafness, but the inflexibility of parents and teachers. The deaf community wants to be heard. Not for the first time in their lives, no one's listening.
A new language for the deaf, one of our stories tomorrow. And that's it for tonight, and that's it from me. I'm about to go on holiday. Jeff Sims will be presenting the program tomorrow night, and from next week, Karina Kelly will be with you for 2 weeks. So from me, Happy New Year and good night.
Aboriginal communities around the country are changing and adapting to the demands of modern Australia, while protecting and developing their own culture.
I want the Aboriginal culture to go on for centuries.
Main thing is sharing and caring.
Some communities have developed a special event of their own. Unlike the glitzy Deb balls of the white culture, these events are seen as a celebration of the family. First in a new series of Blackout, 8 o'clock Thursday, ABC.